The room had been loud just seconds ago. Talking points flying, smirks, cheap shots. Marjorie Taylor Greene had just doubled down, again, this time defending the bombings in Gaza as necessary. Cameras caught every word. And then, silence. Because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez leaned forward, adjusted her mic, and calmly, surgically, tore through the hypocrisy. No shouting, no drama. Just a voice so sharp, it cut through the noise like a blade through fog. She wasn't just responding, she was holding up a mirror to a room that didn't want to look. And for the first time that day, no one had anything left to say. This story, while dramatized, reflects the very real emotions, tensions, and moral questions gripping our politics right now. The characters and events have been fictionalized for narrative impact, but the outrage, the silence, and the courage, those are real. The House Oversight Committee chamber was never meant to feel like a battlefield, but today it did. The lights overhead flickered, not because they were broken, but because they were old. Too old. Relics from a time when words carried more weight than volume. The room hummed faintly with static from microphones being adjusted, tested, rechecked. C-SPAN's red tally light blinked steadily like a countdown no one could stop. At the center of it all, a long polished table stretched across the front, flanked by heavy chairs, some occupied by silence, others by smirking calculation. Aide after aide scurried past like shadows, clutching binders, whispering names, and glancing nervously toward two seats. One in the center left, the other on the far right. In the center left seat sat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, quiet, focused. She flipped through a small leather notebook, its pages filled with annotations, highlighter streaks, and underlined phrases only she fully understood. Her blazer was deep navy, almost black, and her posture was still, upright, as though bracing for incoming fire. But her eyes scanned the room like a radar tuned not to noise but intent. She was reading the room, reading the people, reading the silence between syllables. Then, heels, sharp, intentional. Marjorie Taylor Greene entered like a queen returning to her court, her blazer blinding white, flag pin disproportionately large, hair lacquered into something between a helmet and a warning sign. She didn't just walk, she strutted. Each step was a message. I'm not here to listen, I'm here to dominate. Her voice cracked the atmosphere before she even reached her seat. A loud greeting to a colleague, a jab at a Democrat under her breath, but loud enough to be heard. She tossed a stack of papers on the desk with a slap that echoed too long. And for a moment, no one spoke. Not because they respected the silence, but because something was off. You could feel it, an atmospheric pressure, invisible but undeniable. The aides paused. One even dropped a pen, a small sound, but in that chamber, today it rang like a pin pulled from a grenade. Cameras adjusted, microphones blinked. A red light went live. Something was coming. AOC glanced up just briefly. Her fingers stopped moving. Across the room, Greene smirked. Their eyes met for less than a second, but that second was a conversation. You've gone too far. Try and stop me. From the outside, the chamber looked like any other hearing room. Wood paneling, American flags, solemn portraits of forgotten men. But today, this room was different. This room wasn't just about oversight. It was about reckoning. There had been whispers before the session that Greene had prepared something, that she planned to name names, that she'd use Gaza not as a subject of policy, but as a weapon of provocation, a human tragedy twisted into talking points. And AOC, she knew it. She didn't know the script, but she knew the play. She had seen this kind of ambush before. But this time, she wasn't just ready to defend herself. She was ready to flip the script. Because today's hearing wasn't just another partisan circus. Today would leave blood on the floor, figuratively perhaps, but unmistakably. In the control booth behind the glass, a junior producer mouthed to her colleague, "Keep that camera on AOC. Trust me." No one noticed the subtle change in her breathing, but everyone would remember what she said next. The murmurs in the chamber hadn't settled when Marjorie Taylor Greene adjusted her microphone and began speaking without waiting for recognition. Her tone was falsely casual, but every word dripped with calculation. She glanced sideways, ensuring the cameras were still rolling, then leaned forward, locking her gaze not on any legislation or report, but squarely on Representative Jasmine Crockett. "Some of us," Green began, her voice just loud enough to stretch beyond civility, "still believe in accountability and in this committee's purpose, not in race-baiting distractions or dramatic hairstyles meant for cable news, not Congress." There it was, sharp, dressed in plausible deniability, but no one in the room misread it. Gasps scattered through the rows like ripples on a still lake. A staffer 2 seats away froze with a notepad half raised. A Republican member coughed awkwardly into his hand, pretending to fumble with his papers. Across the aisle, someone shifted uncomfortably, the legs of their chair creaking against the floor. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't need to. The insult wasn't designed to spark a direct confrontation with her. It was thrown like a rock into the middle of the room, meant to cause distraction and feed headlines. But everyone knew who the target was, and so did Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. AOC didn't speak, not yet. She remained seated, fingers gently interlocked, jaw tightening ever so slightly. Her eyes narrowed, just enough for those watching closely to notice. She turned her head slowly toward Green, not with shock, but with a knowing look. It was the look of someone who had heard this tune before, a song with too many verses and far too few consequences. The chair, Representative Comer, sat statue still. He blinked, then continued writing something on his notepad, ignoring the silence that had begun to settle like ash across the room. No motion to strike Green's words, no call for decorum, nothing. And that absence, the space where a line should have been drawn and wasn't, was the real violence. AOC's stare did not break. She leaned back, not in retreat but in preparation. Her slow breath in was the only sound she made, yet it carried weight. It wasn't anger in her expression, it was restraint. Her silence wasn't hesitation, it was discipline, measured and intentional. A warning. Across the room, Green smiled faintly, as if satisfied she had won the moment. But she mistook silence for surrender. What she didn't understand, what she never seemed to understand, was that some women weren't trained to yell back. They were trained to wait, to watch, to strike when it would echo. And at that moment, even though she hadn't said a word, AOC had already taken the room. Because sometimes it's not the words spoken that shift the balance. It's the moment when everyone in the room realizes someone has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, and the person across from them isn't going to let them walk away unscathed. What came next wouldn't be loud, but it would be unforgettable. The silence that followed Marjorie Taylor Greene's veiled attack lingered longer than anyone expected. It wasn't the quiet of confusion. It was the stillness that arrives when a line has been crossed and everyone knows it. Some looked down. Others shifted in their seats, hoping the moment would pass without demanding their attention. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez knew better. Moments like these never pass. They fester. And if no one names the violation, it becomes the new normal. She reached for her microphone, not with haste, but with purpose. Her fingers moved with control, every motion deliberate, as if reclaiming the space Green had tried to corrupt. The red light on her mic blinked on, soft but certain. And when she began to speak, it was not with fury, but with clarity so sharp it made people lift their heads. "Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice even, "what we just witnessed was not merely inappropriate. It was a deliberate erosion of the standards this body once held sacred." No objection. Comer did not look up. AOC didn't wait. She continued, eyes scanning the room, pausing on those who had chosen silence. There was a time not long ago when even using the word "you" on this floor, just the second person, was grounds for a formal motion to strike. That wasn't about formality for formality's sake. It was about discipline, about ensuring that this chamber would never again descend into the kind of violence that once left Senator Charles Sumner bloodied on the Senate floor for simply speaking against slavery. The room tightened around her words. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had history on her side. And it wasn't a lecture, it was a reminder. One some in that room had hoped everyone had forgotten. "But today," she went on, "we saw something else. Not just the words from Representative Green, which were beneath the dignity of this institution, but the collective decision by every Republican in this committee to vote in favor of those words, to codify them, to protect them. She paused, letting the weight settle. There was a procedural vote held just last week in which every Republican here, every single one, voted against striking language that would have been censured in any other era. You didn't just tolerate that language. You ratified it. Some shifted in their seats again. The truth of it was too close, too accurate. It left little room for comfort. This isn't about one comment. This is about a pattern, a permission structure built on complicity. It's about weaponizing identity, silencing dissent, and turning this chamber into a spectacle of cruelty. There was no anger in her voice, but there was heat, controlled and focused. She was not asking for decency. She was expecting it, and she was documenting the failure in real time. Her gaze rested for a beat on Green, who now sat with arms folded, her smirk beginning to fade. "You may think," AOC said slowly, "that your words today were just another performance. But for those of us who come from communities that have heard this language all our lives, who've had it shape the way we're treated in classrooms, hospitals, airports, what you said today wasn't clever. It was cruel." A final pause, one long enough for everyone to wonder if she would stop there. Then came the line, calm, steady, unblinking. "If you don't want none," she said, "don't start none." She clicked her mic off, and no one dared respond. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez left the committee room that afternoon, the silence still rang in her ears. Not the silence that followed her final words. She had learned to live with that kind. No, this was the silence that came after something sacred had been broken, and the people who broke it pretended nothing had happened. The real damage hadn't started with Green's comment. That was just the surface. The real shift, the part no one outside the room had seen, happened days earlier, during a vote most Americans didn't even know had occurred. A procedural motion, buried in committee business, disguised in language only insiders could parse. On its face, it sounded like administrative housekeeping. In practice, it was a quiet demolition of a wall that had stood for over a century. AOC remembered the motion clearly. It came without warning, slipped into the session under the pretense of modernizing decorum provisions. She had felt the weight of it immediately. She read every line twice, then again, because it didn't make sense, until it did. It wasn't modernization. It was deregulation of decency. The motion removed long-standing constraints on what members could say about one another during official proceedings. Words once considered out of bounds, racial dog whistles, personal attacks, even coded hate, would no longer be subject to censure as long as they were deemed political in nature. The ambiguity wasn't an oversight, it was the point. She remembered sitting in her chair during the vote, watching as member after member on the Republican side voted yes without discussion, without hesitation. A few Democrats tried to push back, submitting clarifying amendments, calling for debate, but the majority steamrolled past them. It was all over in less than an hour. There was no press release, no public statement, just a quiet erasure of guardrails that had been in place since the 1800s. Put there after Congressman Preston Brooks walked onto the Senate floor and nearly beat Charles Sumner to death with a cane for denouncing slavery. Those rules, what some now dismissed as ceremonial, had been designed not to restrict speech, but to stop that kind of violence from ever returning. They were meant to cool the temperature when passion ran hot. They were meant to preserve the institution, and now they were gone. AOC had spent the last few nights rereading the House handbook from her first term. She still had it, tucked away behind stacks of briefing notes. It wasn't a sacred text, but it mattered to her. Not for the rules themselves, but for what they represented. A code, a standard, a baseline agreement that power must never excuse cruelty. She thought back to her freshman orientation when a senior member had told her, "You may not always agree with your colleagues, but we respect the chamber." At the time, she hadn't been sure if it was a warning or an ideal. Now she was certain it had become a lie. What haunted her most wasn't that Green had said what she said. It was that Green had been emboldened by a system that had quietly, deliberately made room for it. A vote had made her behavior permissible. A vote had told her, go ahead. There's nothing left to stop you. And now the burden of drawing the line no longer rested on rules. It rested on people willing to speak. The next evening, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat across from the host in a softly lit MSNBC studio. The hearing clip had already gone viral, cut, clipped, and captioned in dozens of ways. One version had racked up millions of views with the title, AOC destroys MTG in under 60 seconds. Another framed it as 2 women, 1 chamber, no rules left. She had seen the headlines but hadn't reacted. That wasn't why she spoke. That wasn't the point. The host smiled politely but leaned in, the tone familiar, calm on the surface, skeptical underneath. Congresswoman, he began, there's no doubt that was a powerful moment. But some are saying your response was more performance than policy. That this was, well, theater. What do you say to that? She didn't blink, didn't smile. She had heard this question before, asked in different ways, each time implying that passion from a woman, especially a woman like her, was somehow disingenuous. I'm not here for applause, she said evenly. I'm here because someone has to name the rot. The words landed with a pause. Not dramatic, just true. She adjusted in her seat slightly, glancing to the side as if pulling the right memory forward. Let's be honest, she continued. Politics in this country has always had an element of performance. That's not new. The difference is what we choose to perform and why. She explained that when members of Congress stage outrage over imaginary book bans, when they shout about gas stoves and weaponize religion to justify cruelty, no one questions if that is theater. But when someone like her calls out institutional decay, the response is to accuse her of putting on a show. What you saw in that hearing wasn't a performance, she said. It was accountability. It was drawing a line because the rules had been erased. The host nodded slowly, but AOC wasn't finished. She knew the country was watching, not just the polished segment, but the tension underneath, the cynicism that had taken root in people's minds. She knew what it looked like when politicians yelled just to be seen, and she wanted to make clear, this wasn't that. Calling out racism in real time, defending a colleague from a targeted attack, that's not theater. That's moral clarity. And the fact that we've reached a point where clarity looks unusual says a lot more about the institution than it does about me. The studio went quiet for a second too long. It wasn't dead air. It was discomfort. Truth has a way of creating that. She continued, softer now, but no less firm. You don't survive in a place like Congress by being dramatic. You survive by being useful. And the easiest way to be useful is to say nothing when things get ugly. That's what the system teaches you. That silence is safe. She let that sit for a beat, then finished. But I didn't come here to stay safe. I came here to tell the truth, even when it makes people uncomfortable, especially when it does. And with that, the conversation moved on. But the line had already been drawn. As the car pulled away from the MSNBC building and merged into early evening traffic, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat quietly in the back seat, her phone screen dark in her lap, untouched. The city blurred past the windows, but she wasn't seeing the skyline. Her mind was still in that studio chair, still circling the question, was that performance or principle? It wasn't the first time someone had asked, and it wouldn't be the last. The framing had changed over the years, but the implication was always the same. A woman like her couldn't possibly be serious. Not if she raised her voice, not if she pushed back, not if her words made people uncomfortable. She remembered the first time she truly felt the sting of that double standard. Not in Congress, long before that. It was during a tenant organizing meeting in the Bronx years ago, when she had just started showing up to meetings and asking questions that no one else dared. That night, she had spoken passionately about rent control and legal loopholes. She had cited figures and case law. But afterward, an older man, well-dressed, familiar with power, had pulled her aside with a patronizing smile and said, "You're smart, but you need to calm down. You'll get more done if you don't sound so angry." It wasn't the words themselves that stung. It was the ease with which he'd said them, as if neutralizing her voice was just another form of mentoring. She had nodded politely, as she'd been taught to do, and then spent the entire subway ride home wondering if he was right. Maybe anger was weakness. Maybe emotion was a liability. Maybe to be taken seriously, she had to be quieter, smaller, easier to digest. For a while she tried that. Tried adjusting her tone, softening the edges of her arguments, hiding the urgency in her voice. But nothing changed. The room stayed cold, the interruptions continued, and the condescension only deepened. It became clear that it had never been about tone. It had always been about threat, about what it meant to have a woman of color speak with authority and not flinch. That realization didn't just shift her thinking, it clarified her purpose. She wasn't angry because she was irrational. She was angry because she cared. And that care had consequences. It meant refusing to normalize cruelty just to appear polite. It meant challenging power structures that others had accepted as immovable. It meant saying what needed to be said, even if her voice shook, even if the backlash came swift, even if the headlines mischaracterized her every word. She thought again about Green's attack on Jasmine Crockett and the way no one moved to intervene. The stillness of that room hadn't come from respect. It came from fear, from calculation, from complicity. If she had stayed silent, no one would have blamed her. They would have said she was being professional, but it would have been the kind of professionalism that erases people like Jasmine, that erases the history that built her own voice. So she spoke, not for applause, not for airtime, but because silence in moments like that costs more than most people realize. She'd learned to wear the blazer, to speak the language, to play the part, but underneath it all, the fire still burned, controlled, focused, necessary. Some called it anger. She called it honesty. And she learned through hard experience that sometimes the most responsible thing you can be in the face of injustice was unapologetically furious. The next morning, AOC sat in her Capitol Hill office, reviewing footage sent to her from humanitarian contacts on the ground in Rafah. No news anchors narrated these clips. No graphics softened the reality. Just raw, unfiltered glimpses into what war did to the bodies too small to run. One video showed a hospital corridor turned triage center, IV bags hanging from coat hooks, babies wrapped in bloodied gauze, and parents too shell-shocked to cry. Another showed a classroom reduced to broken cement and twisted metal, its blackboard still clinging to the wall, half covered in chalk words that would never be finished. In the background, a child's shoe, untouched by ash, sat pointed toward the camera like an accusation. She pressed pause. The screen froze on a frame that would stay with her far longer than any headline. A boy, maybe 6, covered in soot, holding the hand of someone no longer alive. His lips were parted, not in a scream, but in the absence of one. The silence inside that image was louder than any speech she could give. Later that afternoon, she returned to the House floor. The chamber was half full, with members filtering in and out, reading emails, checking their phones, unconcerned with what they were about to hear. She didn't raise her voice, didn't call for attention. She simply stood, was recognized, and began. "Mr. Speaker," she said, "I rise today because something horrific is unfolding before our eyes. And the longer we pretend it is someone else's problem, the more accountable we become for letting it happen." Her voice was steady, but there was weight in every syllable. She spoke of Rafah not as a foreign flashpoint, but as a human emergency. She described the bombed hospitals not as tragic errors, but as foreseeable consequences of indifference. She told the story of a doctor who used his own body to shield his last surviving patient, a child, and died doing it. She recited without theatrics the names of schools that had been targeted, UN shelters that had been reduced to debris, and children who would never again sit in a classroom, never again sleep without fear. She paused only once, to take a breath that was clearly harder than it should have been. Then came the line she had been building toward, not a slogan, not a partisan attack, but a moral judgment. "This is not neutrality," she said, voice quiet but firm. "This is complicity." No one interrupted. For once, no one tried to. Her words hung in the air, suspended like dust in sunlight. A few members glanced up from their phones. One Republican looked down, suddenly interested in a paperclip. She didn't offer solutions in that moment. She didn't propose legislation or recite funding figures. She simply bore witness. That was her job today, not just to legislate, but to remind this body, this nation, that policies have consequences, and those consequences had faces. Small ones, ash-covered, silent, dead. After her speech, she gathered her notes without looking up. She knew what would happen next. Some would accuse her of emotional manipulation, others would call her naive, and a few would change the subject altogether. But none of them would forget the silence that followed her words. Because somewhere beneath all the posturing and political distance, they had seen what she'd seen, the children behind the smoke. That evening, after the speech about Rafah had begun circulating online, AOC met with a small group of staffers and foreign policy advisors in her office. The mood was quiet, but not uncertain. They all knew what came next. It wasn't just about calling out Republicans for cruelty. It was about confronting the silence of those who claimed to be allies, those within her own party. And that was always harder. She stood by the whiteboard as one of her staffers recapped the latest statement from the White House. It was full of grave concern and urgent calls for restraint, but devoid of action. AOC exhaled slowly, marker cap in hand, before writing 3 words in thick black strokes: tools, leverage, law. They keep saying there's not much we can do, she said, but that's not true. There's plenty we can do if we're willing to stop hiding behind process. She tapped the board and began listing one by one the actions the administration could take without needing a single new bill to pass. First, enforce Leahy law restrictions. If we have credible evidence of human rights abuses tied to U.S. weapons, we are obligated to halt transfers. That's not a radical left position. That's U.S. law. She moved to the next. Second, apply the Arms Export Control Act properly. We're not supposed to send weapons unless we're confident they're used in accordance with international law. Can we really say that's happening right now in Gaza? No one spoke. No one needed to. Third, she said, circling the final point, stop shielding the ICC from doing its job. If we believe in accountability, it can't just apply to our enemies. It has to apply to our allies too. One staffer cautiously asked what she already knew. If you go out and push this message hard, you'll be distancing yourself from the administration, publicly. Do you want that fight right now? AOC looked at him, not with anger, but with something quieter, more worn. It's not about wanting the fight. It's about not pretending we're powerless when we're not. I campaigned for this president. I've defended this administration more times than I can count. But we are watching a humanitarian catastrophe unfold in real time, and offering statements of concern while continuing business as usual is not diplomacy. It's cowardice. She paused, resting her hand on the back of her chair. Her tone softened, but her resolve deepened. I know what it looks like. I know how this will be framed. Dividing the party, handing talking points to the right. But justice doesn't care about re-election cycles. Children don't pause their suffering so we can get our messaging right. She thought again about the boy in the video, the one whose silence had spoken louder than 1,000 statements. She wasn't trying to destroy alliances or burn bridges. But if she couldn't say these things now, when they mattered most, then her voice in those rooms meant nothing. I didn't run for office to manage perceptions, she said quietly, almost to herself. I ran because someone needed to say the hard thing, in the hard moment. She looked around the room. Her team wasn't nodding or applauding or offering reassurance. They just listened, because they knew. This wasn't just strategy anymore. It was conscience. And sometimes what a nation loses in silence is greater than anything at risk by speaking. When AOC returned to the House chamber the next day, there was no mistaking the shift in atmosphere. It wasn't loud. No confrontations greeted her, no direct challenges or mocking jeers. But the shift was there, in the way colleagues averted their eyes when she walked past, in the way conversations trailed off mid-sentence as she approached, in the way silence seemed to cling to her presence like a heavy coat. Not an absence of sound, but a withdrawal of comfort. The kind of cold that settles in, not because the air has changed, but because everyone has decided to stop pretending nothing happened. She took her seat as usual, laying out her notes with the same methodical care. She didn't look up often, but she didn't have to. She could feel it, the discomfort, the calculations, the quiet anticipation of what she might say next, and whether it would make things harder For others, of course, not for her, because they had already decided that truth was inconvenient, and truth spoken aloud was dangerous. She had crossed a line, not by lying or exaggerating, but by naming what too many were trying desperately to downplay. She hadn't planned to use the word, not at first, but after the videos, after the children, after the unwillingness of those in power to even consider withholding weapons while civilians were being buried under collapsed buildings. How could she not? When her name was called, she stood. The usual shuffle of papers stopped. Some members leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed. Others looked down, deliberately busying themselves with non-existent notes. But no one left. They were listening, even if they didn't want to. She began the way she always did, with facts, with names, dates, satellite images, death tolls confirmed by independent humanitarian organizations. She quoted medical staff who had run out of morphine for pediatric surgeries. She cited field reports of families using trash bags as body covers because shrouds were no longer available. And then, without raising her voice, without changing her tone, she said it. What we are witnessing, she stated, is a genocide in real time. The effect was immediate. Stillness hardened into tension. A quiet collective flinch moved through the chamber, though no one spoke. Even her allies shifted in their seats, startled by the clarity of the word. Because that word, genocide, was not policy language. It was not diplomatic. It was not safe. But it was accurate. Across the aisle, Marjorie Taylor Greene tilted her head, smirking. She leaned toward the colleague beside her and muttered something under her breath, too low for the mics to catch. But AOC saw her lips move, saw the smug amusement in her eyes, and knew exactly what was being whispered. Something dismissive, something cruel, something calculated to provoke. AOC didn't flinch. She didn't glance over. She didn't let Greene steal even a sliver of her attention. Her words had not been for her. They had been for the record, for the history that would one day ask where this chamber stood when the world was watching. She finished her statement with a calm reminder that under U.S. and international law, withholding support from war crimes was not an act of betrayal, but of duty, and that no member of Congress should ever fear using accurate language more than they fear the consequences of inaction. As she returned to her seat, no one spoke. Not in support, not in challenge, just that cold, reverberating silence. But that was fine. She didn't need the room to warm up to her. She needed it to wake up. The email arrived with no warning, buried among a flood of routine memos and committee updates. AOC had almost overlooked it. The subject line was bland. Upcoming joint session planning notice. But as she scanned the contents, a cold weight settled in her chest. The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, had been formally invited to deliver an address before a joint session of Congress. Not through the State Department, not as part of a diplomatic dialogue, but as an honored guest. A head of government currently facing an active arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court was about to be given one of the most prestigious platforms in American politics. She read the email again, slower this time, hoping she'd misunderstood. She hadn't. The invitation was bipartisan, coordinated behind closed doors, and framed as an opportunity to strengthen the historic U.S.-Israel alliance. Nowhere in the text was Gaza mentioned, not Rafah, not the bombed hospitals, not the tens of thousands of civilians displaced in less than a year, not a word about the children who hadn't eaten in 3 days, or the mass graves, or the journalists killed in drone strikes. She stared at the screen for a long moment, then stood and walked to the window. The Capitol dome stood tall against a cloudless sky, its symmetry unmarred by the chaos inside. She'd always known this place could be callous. She hadn't expected it to become surreal. Later that day, she was asked about the invitation during a press scrum outside her office. The cameras swiveled toward her, and the question came quickly without preamble. "Congresswoman, how do you respond to the upcoming address by Prime Minister Netanyahu?" She didn't need a script. "I think it is disgraceful," she said. "A man who is actively presiding over the collective punishment of an entire civilian population is being welcomed with open arms by the United States Congress. A war criminal given a standing ovation by the world's most powerful democracy?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The bluntness of the statement did the work for her. The reporters scribbled, murmuring among themselves. But she wasn't finished. Inviting Netanyahu right now, at this precise moment, is not diplomacy, it's endorsement. It sends a message to the world that our outrage is selective, our principles conditional, and it undermines every American official who's ever claimed to care about human rights. Back in her office, she pulled up the ICC's report. She read the charges again. Targeting civilian infrastructure, obstructing humanitarian aid, deliberate displacement, starvation as a weapon of war. These weren't vague allegations. They were detailed, evidence-based, documented by multiple international observers. She wasn't naive about geopolitics. She understood alliances, deterrence, and strategy. But there came a point when strategic ambiguity turned into moral failure. And this was that point. She remembered watching her colleagues clap for leaders who'd led invasions, coups, and bombings. But there was something uniquely disturbing about this moment. The audacity of staging celebration while Gaza burned. It was like applauding a man while ignoring the ash on his hands. She knew her words would be met with backlash, that some would accuse her of betraying Israel, or undermining unity, or being too emotional, too provocative. But she also knew this. Silence in the face of calculated brutality wasn't neutrality, it was participation. The fallout from Netanyahu's invitation hadn't even settled before a new controversy erupted. This one quieter in tone, but far more dangerous in implication. A group of senators from both parties had begun floating a draft proposal to sanction the International Criminal Court. The justification was as predictable as it was disturbing. The ICC had overstepped by issuing arrest warrants against sitting officials of a U.S. ally. The unspoken message was simpler. Accountability was fine, but only when it didn't apply to people we supported. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez read the proposal with a growing sense of disbelief. It didn't just challenge a legal body, it threatened to dismantle the very concept of impartial justice. The bill wasn't law yet, but it had traction. Republican senators championed it openly. Some Democrats, hesitant and vague in public, whispered privately that they might support limited restrictions. Even Secretary Blinken had said he was open to working with lawmakers on a measured response. That phrase struck her like a blow. Measured response to what? To war crimes? To a court functioning precisely as it was designed to? In a statement released later that evening, AOC didn't hold back. "Let's be absolutely clear," she wrote. "This isn't about sovereignty. It's about impunity. The ICC is the only standing court tasked with investigating crimes that transcend borders, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. If we sanction it now, not because it failed, but because it succeeded, we are setting fire to the court that holds the line for humanity." She gave interviews, drafted op-eds, and spoke at length with members of her caucus, urging them to understand what was at stake. This wasn't just a legal debate, it was a moral one, and the consequences would extend far beyond Israel or Gaza. If we destroy the credibility of the ICC, she warned in one closed-door meeting, then what exactly do we say to victims in Sudan, or Ukraine, or Myanmar when they seek justice? What's to stop Putin from dismissing war crime charges as political attacks when we're doing the exact same thing? The room had gone still when she said it, not because the logic was complex, but because it was undeniable. We don't get to be outraged at other nations ignoring international law while we chip away at the very court that enforces it, she added. It wasn't lost on her that some of the same senators who had condemned Russia's aggression in Ukraine were now threatening to defund and discredit the very institution meant to pursue accountability. The hypocrisy wasn't just obvious, it was corrosive. It eroded global trust. It made justice look like a tool of power rather than a shield for the vulnerable. What disturbed her most, however, wasn't the hypocrisy. It was the speed with which principles were abandoned the moment they became inconvenient. For decades, the U.S. had held itself up as a champion of rule-based order. Now it was considering punishing a court for following its own rules too closely. AOC understood the risk of her position. The backlash would be swift, the accusations fierce. But for her, the question was simple. If powerful nations could silence the law by threatening the referee, then the whole game was already rigged. And she hadn't come to Congress to play along. The MSNBC set felt colder than the last time she'd been there. Or maybe it was just her. AOC sat beneath the bright clinical lights, listening as the host gently walked her through the day's events. The ICC controversy, the Netanyahu invitation, the political firestorm now gathering around her name. The tone was civil, even warm, but she could sense what was coming next. It wasn't malice. It was a question built on fatigue, a question designed to invite restraint. "Congresswoman," the host began, "some of your colleagues say your language is too harsh, that calling it genocide or opposing the ICC sanctions this directly could hurt unity within the party. What would you say to them?" AOC sat still for a breath. Her fingers rested loosely in her lap. She didn't fidget, but something in her jaw tightened. Barely, but enough. "I'd ask them," she said quietly, "how many children have to die before a word becomes accurate?" The host blinked. The air shifted. AOC continued, not with force, but with depth. There was no anger in her tone, no theatrical crescendo. Just a slow, steady release of something that had been weighing on her chest for days, maybe longer. "I'm not saying these things because they're easy," she said, "or because I want to make headlines. I'm saying them because the silence around this has become unbearable." Her voice wavered, not out of fear or emotion she couldn't control, but from the pressure of carrying too much alone. And for a moment it cracked, just slightly, on the next sentence. "It's not weakness to name what others won't." She inhaled slowly, gathering herself, not to hide the crack, but to steady the message it carried. The moment passed, but it had already done its work. The weight of what she said settled into the air like truth no one wanted but couldn't deny. "There are people," she went on, "in this very building who say they believe in human rights, until it's politically inconvenient, who call themselves defenders of democracy until it means holding an ally accountable, who support justice until the court hands down the wrong verdict." The host didn't interrupt. She simply let her talk. "And what does that teach the world?" AOC asked, her voice gaining strength now. "That if you're powerful enough, the rules don't apply to you? That we prosecute war crimes when it's our enemies, but bury the files when it's our friends?" She leaned forward slightly, her hands now open on the desk, palms down, grounded. Her tone was calm, but there was fire beneath it. Not the fire of outrage, but the fire of moral clarity, the kind that doesn't cool with applause, the kind that burns long after the cameras stop rolling. "We cannot keep teaching that laws are flexible for the powerful and rigid for the powerless. That is not justice. That is control dressed up as principle." She glanced toward the host, not challengingly, but with finality. "If laws are only for the weak," she said, her voice steady again, "then they're not laws. They're weapons." There was nothing left to say. The host didn't try to pivot. The moment didn't need more words. It had already said everything. Back in her office late that night, AOC sat alone at the small conference table tucked into the corner by the window. The lights outside Capitol Hill glowed in the distance. But inside, the room was quiet except for the soft rustle of pages. In front of her lay an old worn copy of the House Rules and Manual, something she had kept since her first term. The cover was creased at the corners, the spine fraying from use, but the text inside was clear. It wasn't nostalgia that brought her to it. It was necessity. She needed to remind herself what this institution was supposed to be. She flipped to the section on decorum. The words were dry, procedural, easy to overlook. But between the legalese was something solid. There were lines in the past that couldn't be crossed without consequence. One rule read, "No member shall refer to another in the second person, nor speak disrespectfully or imputing motives to a colleague." Another stated, "Personal attacks, even indirect, shall be met with motions to strike and, if necessary, disciplinary review." And there, in the margin, she had underlined a line added in 1836. "The dignity of the chamber is to be upheld not only in word, but in tone and intent." That was nearly 2 centuries ago, before microphones, before television, before social media. And yet somehow they had understood the stakes. They had lived through violence, real violence, when a senator was nearly beaten to death on the chamber floor. And in the aftermath, they wrote rules not for style, but for survival. They codified restraint, because they understood what happened when words went unchecked, and now that legacy was being casually discarded. AOC thought again of Marjorie Taylor Greene's remarks. The smirk, the thinly veiled insult, the way no one on her side of the aisle blinked when she said it. 20 years ago, hell, even 10 years ago, those words would have sparked a bipartisan response. A motion to strike, at the very least. A reprimand. But now? Now they were normalized, rebranded as plain talk, as honesty, even as authenticity. Somewhere along the way, cruelty had been elevated to a political skill set, but AOC refused to blame just Green. That would be too easy. The real problem wasn't one person, it was a culture, a shifting tide in which shame no longer existed, in which decency had become a liability. It was the fact that Green was applauded in certain corners of the country for the very behavior that, once upon a time, would have been grounds for formal discipline. It was that colleagues who knew better said nothing, not because they agreed, but because they feared the noise machine more than they feared the moral cost of silence. She closed the handbook and sat back, her hand resting on its cracked leather cover. The chamber hadn't changed overnight. It had been chipped away, bit by bit, by people who knew exactly what they were doing, by lawmakers who realized that outrage was currency and that rules were only as strong as the collective will to enforce them. And now, she thought, the institution was nearing a breaking point. Not because someone like Green had gone too far, but because too many others had decided there was no longer a line to protect. The pages of that old handbook were still here, but the values within them had become optional, and that, she knew, was the real danger. The news came not with fanfare, but with an unusual silence, a silence that, in Washington, always meant something was off script. As the latest House roll call appeared on the public ledger, AOC's eyes scanned the names out of habit, expecting the usual party line unity. But there it was, buried halfway down the column: Boebert, nay, not present, not abstain, a full-on rejection, a refusal to back Marjorie Taylor Greene's amendment to gut the ethics clause that had once, however weakly, still held members to a minimum standard of conduct. At first, AOC assumed it was a mistake, a clerical error, a misclick on the voting system, but minutes later reporters confirmed it. Boebert had intentionally broken ranks, refusing to support her usual ally. The same Boebert who had built her career on echoing Greene's rhetoric, who often seemed to treat congressional proceedings like open mic night at a grievance rally, had quietly peeled away. No statement, no explanation, just distance. In the hallway after the vote, the whispers began, staffers trading glances, aides texting faster than they could think. Greene's camp offered nothing but a clipped no comment, which only fueled speculation. AOC didn't speak about it publicly, but in her mind, the question lingered. Did she finally feel it? Not guilt, not empathy. AOC didn't imagine that came easily to someone like Boebert, but something had shifted. Perhaps it was the weight of public scrutiny. Perhaps it was the slow realization that the political theater had turned grotesque, or maybe, just maybe, Boebert had caught a glimpse of the cliff's edge and realized that following Greene any further meant tumbling into a space where even performative politics couldn't protect her. Back in her office, AOC replayed the memory of the previous week, the moment Greene attacked Jasmine Crockett with racial undertones that weren't even thinly veiled. Boebert had been there, close enough to hear, close enough to laugh if she wanted to, but she hadn't. She'd sat back, expression unreadable, arms crossed, gaze low. And now she had cast a vote that, while not heroic, was at least surprising. AOC didn't romanticize it. One vote wasn't a transformation. Silence was still complicity. Boebert hadn't called out Greene. She hadn't defended Crockett, but she hadn't lined up in full support either. And in a place where loyalty was often traded like currency, even that subtle hesitation meant something. It raised an uncomfortable but necessary question. Was this the beginning of a shift, or just a pause? AOC knew not to expect a wave of conscience from those who had built their careers on outrage, but she also understood the power of cracks in a wall. Not because they collapsed the whole structure at once, but because they mark the first proof that it's not unbreakable. Maybe Boebert had grown tired of carrying Green's chaos. Maybe she saw how quickly public sentiment could turn, how easily the audience could become a jury. Or maybe she had just done the math and decided this particular battle wasn't worth fighting. Regardless of the reason, the message was clear. The allegiance that had once seemed immovable had shifted, even if only slightly. And in this town, slight shifts mattered. AOC didn't celebrate it, she didn't trust it, but she noticed it, and she filed it away, not as a victory, but as a variable. Because even the smallest retreat can mean a larger reckoning is on the horizon. The disparity wasn't new, but it never stopped stinging. AOC had learned early on that the rules in Congress didn't apply equally to everyone. They were enforced not according to written codes, but according to comfort, whose tone unsettled the room, whose presence disrupted expectation, whose voice sounded like defiance when it was merely conviction. And for women of color, that bar shifted constantly, always hovering just out of reach. She remembered with painful clarity her first floor speech as a freshman. She had practiced every word, rehearsed every inflection, careful not to sound too sharp, too emotional, too forceful. But in the middle of delivering her remarks, she referred to another member simply as you. The chamber's energy shifted immediately. A Republican colleague raised a point of order, citing a violation of decorum. The chair cut her off mid-sentence. She was instructed to strike her words, to restate her comment using the gentlewoman from instead. It was framed as a matter of tradition, nothing personal, but the message was unmistakable. Be careful, be softer, be smaller. That was the standard then. And yet, just days ago, Marjorie Taylor Greene had looked across the room and called another woman, another black woman, disgusting, with full intention, full volume, and no ambiguity. There had been no objection, no motion to strike, no warning from the chair. The word was left in the record, untouched, unchallenged, as though it had never happened at all. AOC kept coming back to that moment, not because she was surprised, but because it encapsulated everything the old rules once tried, however imperfectly, to prevent. What Greene had said wasn't just inappropriate, it was personal, racial, and intended to wound. And yet the silence that followed was more violent than the insult itself. The silence meant acceptance. The silence meant precedent. The silence meant, this is fine now. She thought of all the times women of color on the floor had been cut off, not for insults, not for attacks, but for passion, for emotion, for speaking with urgency. Every time they had raised their voices to meet the scale of injustice, someone had told them to moderate, to manage, to remember their place. But Greene? Greene could say the ugliest things and be protected not in spite of it, but because of it. It wasn't just about Greene. It was about a culture that let her thrive, a culture that bent itself to make her behavior not only permissible, but untouchable. AOC wasn't naive. She didn't expect a perfectly fair system, but she also refused to pretend the current imbalance was invisible. Rules, she had realized, were never the point. Control was the point, and control was only ever exerted in one direction. When power was challenged by someone it didn't expect, someone with the wrong background, the wrong tone, the wrong level of confidence, it reached for rules to bring them back into line. But when that same power was challenged by someone who looked the part, who shouted from within the accepted mold, the rules mysteriously dissolved. She knew this double standard didn't just silence individuals, it warped institutions. It made young staffers watch and wonder if they'd ever be allowed to speak with truth. It made voters question whether democracy was truly representative or simply performative. She'd played by the rules, she'd mastered them, but now, watching them be discarded in real time, she understood something more painful. The rules were never meant to protect people like her. They were meant to control people like her, and to disappear the moment someone like Greene needed cover. In a quiet moment between hearings, AOC found herself standing alone in the Democratic cloakroom, a space designed for pause but rarely used for reflection. The thick carpet muted footsteps, and the heavy curtains shut out the noise from the House floor. It was here, away from cameras and microphones, that she often wrestled with the tension of her position, between loyalty and principle, between solidarity and urgency. She had endorsed President Biden early, Not out of blind allegiance, but out of strategy, out of belief that protecting democracy required coalition, not perfection. She believed in many of the things he stood for: expanding health care, fighting climate change, defending voting rights. But she also believed in holding him accountable when the stakes demanded it. And Gaza had become one of those stakes. What was happening there was not an internal disagreement over tactics. It was a crisis of values. Too many people assumed that to support someone politically meant staying silent when they fell short. But that wasn't how she understood leadership. To her, dissent wasn't betrayal, it was commitment at its highest form. She supported the team, yes, but she refused to cheer from the sidelines when the plays were failing the people they were supposed to protect. She had taken heat from both sides. The far left accused her of selling out, of compromising too easily. The center flinched at every statement she made that strayed from the party's official line. But she stayed in that in-between space because it was real, because most Americans lived there too, wanting progress but also stability, demanding justice but fearing collapse. That space wasn't comfortable, but it was honest, and she understood deeply that part of the discomfort came from something bigger than policy. It came from generational tension, a quiet friction that ran beneath the surface of every caucus meeting. The older members had grown up in a different political world, a world where incremental change was the best you could hope for, where rocking the boat was punished, not praised. But her generation had grown up watching the world burn in real time. Climate disasters, economic collapse, social injustice broadcast live. They didn't have the luxury of waiting. It wasn't about disrespect, it was about urgency. And that urgency often felt like defiance to those who had learned to survive by playing the long game. But for AOC, the long game only made sense if the rules stayed fixed, and lately they weren't. The climate clock was ticking, voter suppression was accelerating, and in Gaza, human lives were being erased while leaders weighed political costs. She couldn't sit in meetings discussing electoral calculus while children starved. That wasn't politics. That was moral failure. She returned to her desk and opened a new document. At the top, she typed, "You can love the house and still want to fix the roof." It wasn't a press release, not yet, but it was the truth she carried with her. She would campaign for the ticket. She would defend the administration against bad faith attacks, but she would also keep speaking, clearly, consistently, about where they were failing. Not because she wanted to break them down, but because she believed they could be better. And believing in better was not insubordination. It was faith, the hard kind, the kind that didn't let go when things got uncomfortable. The hardest part, AOC had come to realize, wasn't identifying the crisis, it was getting people in power to act as though it mattered. By now, no one could claim ignorance. The images from Gaza were public. The casualty counts were tracked in real time. Human rights organizations, legal experts, and even some members of the administration had quietly acknowledged the gravity of what was unfolding. And yet, official action remained maddeningly cautious, as if the avoidance of offense was more urgent than the avoidance of atrocity. She didn't want vague statements. She didn't want another press conference filled with concern and qualified regret. What she wanted, what the moment demanded, was leadership. Real leadership. The kind that didn't wait for permission. The kind that didn't need the political winds to blow in its favor. The kind that made choices based on principle, not polling. And so she began to lay it out, clearly, publicly, and with no room for misinterpretation. The first point was straightforward: enforce the sanctions we already have. The U.S. had existing legislation on the books requiring accountability for human rights violations in the West Bank. It wasn't radical to ask that the law be followed. What was radical, she argued, was the idea that enforcement should be selective, determined not by conduct but by the passport of the perpetrator. Second, immediately suspend offensive weapons transfers. Not all military aid, not humanitarian coordination, but the specific arms used in offensive operations, airstrikes, heavy artillery, demolition equipment. If a government could not prove that its use of these weapons adhered to international law, then it had forfeited the privilege of U.S. support. That was not abandonment. That was a standard, one that every ally, no matter how close, should be expected to meet. And third, and perhaps most politically risky, Publicly support the process of the International Criminal Court. Not dictate it, not manipulate it, but support it. She knew that would cause backlash. The right would accuse her of selling out U.S. sovereignty. The center would warn her about alienating donors. But she refused to accept a version of justice that only functioned when the verdict was convenient. She said it in interviews, on the floor, and in closed-door meetings with senior officials. You cannot champion the rule of law and then denounce the very institution tasked with upholding it just because you don't like where the evidence leads. That's not leadership. That's selective outrage. And she added something else, always with the same deliberate care. The world is watching. And the moral authority we claim as a country is only as real as what we choose to do when the pressure builds. Anyone can speak up when it's safe. But the whole point of leadership is knowing when to speak when it's not. She didn't expect miracles. She knew policy shifts required time, negotiation, leverage. But clarity didn't. And the American people, she believed, deserved that clarity. So did the people in Gaza, in the West Bank, in refugee camps and courtrooms and war zones around the world. If the United States was going to lead, it had to lead with more than rhetoric. It had to lead with courage. And courage always began by naming what needed to change. The building had mostly emptied for the night. The halls were quieter, save for the hum of maintenance carts and the occasional muffled conversation from a late-shift security guard. In her office, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat alone, lit only by the warm desk lamp in the corner. Her jacket had been draped over the back of her chair hours ago, and her shoes were kicked off under the table. The silence was welcome. Not the silence of avoidance, but the kind that allowed thinking without interruption, without performance, without compromise. The cursor on her laptop blinked steadily as she typed, paused, deleted, and typed again. She wasn't drafting a press release or an op-ed for the morning. This was a personal letter, unpublished, possibly never to be sent. It was part reflection, part reckoning, something she had begun writing and rewriting over the course of the week as the backlash mounted, as colleagues distanced themselves, as headlines dissected her every word about Gaza, about the ICC, about standing too far left of the center. The letter wasn't addressed to any one person. It was a kind of note to history, or maybe to the younger version of herself who had once walked into the Capitol in borrowed heels, hoping her presence alone might shift the culture. She had learned quickly that presence wasn't enough, that courage, real courage, was lonely and costly. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing a single sentence, one that stayed on the screen longer than any paragraph that had come before. If I lose my seat for this, so be it. She looked at it without blinking, not as a line of resignation, but of resolution. It wasn't written for drama. It was simply the truth. She knew the risks, had known them from the start. Her district loved her, but public sentiment was volatile. She'd seen what happened to those who spoke too plainly, too early, too often. Her opponents were already lining up to use her words as weapons. Donors were getting nervous. Staffers whispered about strategy, about timing, about how far was too far. But to her, the calculation was simple. What was the point of a seat, of a title, if it came at the expense of the very people she claimed to represent? What was the value of leadership if it demanded silence in moments when a voice was most needed? The torch of moral courage weighed heavy. She'd never deny that. Every vote, every statement, every press inquiry added layers to the burden. It pulled at her some days. It isolated her on others. But it had also become part of who she was. She could no longer imagine leading without that weight in her hands. To drop it now, for the sake of political safety, would be to let go of the reason she ran in the first place. She saved the document but didn't close it. Instead, she leaned back, rubbed the bridge of her nose, and let the words settle in her chest. If the storm came, it came. If the polls dipped, they dipped. If her next election became a referendum on whether moral clarity had a place in American politics, then let it. She hadn't come to Washington to preserve her own career. She had come to change what that career meant. By the next morning, the clip had already crossed 10 million views. By noon, it was trending globally. The final segment of AOC's MSNBC interview, just under 7 minutes, had struck a nerve that no one had fully anticipated. It wasn't a viral moment in the usual sense. There was no shouting, no mic drop, no dramatics, just a steady voice, cracking ever so slightly as it carried the weight of what others had refused to say. And somehow, that restraint, that unembellished honesty, made it all the more powerful. What caught fire wasn't one sentence, but the feeling behind it. The moment when AOC had looked into the camera and said plainly, "If laws are only for the weak, then they're not laws. They're weapons." It wasn't delivered as a punchline. It didn't need to be. It hung in the air like a challenge, one that couldn't be dismissed because it had come from a place too real to ignore. The comments began pouring in almost immediately. Some were expected. Words of encouragement from supporters, frustration from critics, a few vague calls for balance. But beneath the noise were voices that carried something deeper: recognition. A Vietnam veteran wrote, "I didn't agree with you on much before, but what you said last night, that was the kind of truth we used to expect from leaders." A Holocaust survivor's granddaughter posted, "My grandmother used to say silence isn't neutral. It's a choice. Thank you for choosing differently." One comment, short and quietly devastating, simply read, "Thank you for not being afraid to speak when silence would have been easier." AOC read that line twice, then a third time, and she let it sit. She knew those weren't just compliments. They were confessions, admissions from people who had waited too long to hear someone name the obvious, to witness a representative call out the games, the hedging, the moral hesitation that had defined so much of the response to Gaza. And it wasn't just about this one moment. It was about all the moments that had led up to it. Each time the truth had been softened, blurred, diluted to fit into a soundbite or a campaign slogan. She hadn't set out to go viral, but perhaps this was the difference between performance and principle. One faded quickly, the other echoed. Her staff was already talking about the reach, the engagement, the demographics. But AOC wasn't thinking about metrics. She was thinking about what came next. Because once you say the thing others won't, once you name the silence, you can't go back to pretending it isn't there. And she also understood something else. This echo wasn't hers to claim. It didn't start with her. It started in Rafah, in the videos no one wanted to see. It started in committee rooms where decorum was used as a shield for cruelty. It started every time someone said, "Now isn't the time," and someone else answered, "If not now, when?" What had gone viral wasn't just a moment on television. It was the unmistakable sound of someone telling the truth in a room that had forgotten how. And as that truth bounced from screen to screen, comment to comment, across languages and countries and algorithms, AOC understood the real work wasn't done. It had only just begun. The hallway between the Rayburn office building and the Capitol was long, marble-lined, and often empty in the early hours before a vote. It echoed footsteps in a way that made even the most confident strides feel exposed. On this morning, AOC walked with quiet purpose, a folder tucked under her arm, her mind rehearsing the testimony she'd prepared. Not for a committee hearing, but for the record. Something she wanted to enter before the week was over. Something she felt couldn't wait. Just before she reached the connecting door, Marjorie Taylor Greene appeared from the opposite direction, flanked by two aides. Their eyes met for less than a second. Greene said nothing. No insult, no glare, no smirk, just silence. She walked past like AOC was air. It should have felt like a relief, this absence of provocation, this sudden retreat, but it didn't. It felt calculated. Not a surrender, but a cold withdrawal, like a chess player refusing to play the final move, even after the board made it clear there was nothing left to win. Back in her office, AOC sat alone and watched the CSPAN replay on her screen. It was the same clip they'd aired the night before, her speech on the floor, stripped of graphics or commentary. No music, no edits, just her voice, firm but deliberate, laying out the charges history would remember if this body failed to act. Complicity, cowardice, cruelty. As she watched herself on screen, she didn't focus on the delivery or the framing. She watched the chamber. The empty chairs, the bowed heads, the tight lips of colleagues who hadn't spoken, who still hadn't spoken. Democrats who had privately thanked her but wouldn't go near a microphone. Allies who posted cryptic emojis instead of joining her call. The kind of silence that wasn't born of strategy, but fear. Yet outside that chamber, a very different sound was growing. Her inbox was flooded again, this time with testimonies, not just thanks. Teachers writing about students organizing walkouts, doctors sharing what they'd seen in Gaza hospitals on volunteer trips. A mother in Dearborn who said her son had asked if America only cried for certain children. And on social media, the silence in the chamber had transformed. The moment she'd stood alone on the floor now had millions of views, thousands of duets, translations, breakdowns, stitches with footage from protests around the world. The hashtag was trending. Hashtag silence is not neutral. And what echoed back from the public wasn't commentary, it was action. One post caught her eye. It was a photo of an old television playing C-SPAN. In front of the screen sat an elderly man in a wheelchair. The caption was simple, "He's deaf." But when she said genocide, he cried. That was when it clicked. In the chamber, silence had protected power. Outside, silence had become a canvas, on which truth was painted louder than anything spoken from a podium. Green's muteness wasn't a truce, it was an attempt to erase the narrative. But the public wasn't letting her. What MTG refused to say, what others refused to challenge, the people were now shouting in her place. AOC leaned back in her chair. For all the noise she'd made, for all the consequences she'd accepted, it was this, the echo that came from others, that meant the most. Because the final silence in the hallway, in the chamber, in the hearts of those too afraid to speak, was no longer the last word. The people had broken it. It was a Friday afternoon in the Bronx, and the elementary school auditorium buzzed with the kind of unfiltered energy only kids could summon. AOC had come for a routine visit. Part civics, part inspiration, part showing up for the community that had sent her to Washington. She was seated on the edge of the stage, blazer off, sleeves rolled, sneakers laced. The kids sat cross-legged in rows, wide-eyed, some fidgeting, some raising their hands before the Q&A even began. One girl, maybe 10 or 11, waited until the very end. She wore a bright red headband and a backpack twice her size. Her voice was soft but clear when she asked, "Did it hurt when they ignored you?" The room quieted. AOC looked at her for a moment, not with surprise, but with something more tender. Recognition. She smiled gently. "Only a little," she said, "but it hurt more when I stayed silent, so I stopped doing that." There was no applause. Just that kind of stillness that happens when truth lands in a place too young for cynicism. The girl nodded slowly, as if cataloging the words, not for a test, but for later, for life. As the visit wrapped and AOC made her way to the door, she paused briefly by a mural painted along the hallway. It showed past and present leaders, hands raised not in victory, but in voice. She traced a finger over one of the brushstrokes and exhaled. The cameras had moved on. The news cycle was already chewing on something else. But she wasn't waiting for headlines anymore. She had seen the echo land, in young eyes, in old hearts. In those who didn't need permission to speak, just an example that it could be done. The mic was never off. It was just waiting for someone brave enough to use it. This story isn't just about politics. It's about voice. It reminds us that speaking up, especially when it's uncomfortable, isn't a performance. It's a responsibility. AOC's courage lies not in shouting louder, but in standing still when others step back, in choosing principle over popularity. Her refusal to accept silence as neutrality is a powerful reminder that history is shaped by those who refuse to look away. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Leadership isn't always loud. It's consistent, it's human, and it's willing to lose for what's right. What would you speak up about if you knew no one else would? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.